All right, while Democrats continue to make their call for gun control in the wake of the Texas church massacre, President Trump sent a clear message during his trip overseas.
You know, you're bringing up a situation that probably shouldn't be discussed too much right now. We could let a little time go by, but it's okay if you feel that that's an appropriate question. And Chicago is a disaster. It's a total disaster.
The city of Chicago now close to recording its 600th homicide this year. Here to weigh in is Fox News contributor and former Trump Hispanic Advisory Council member Steve Cortes. Steve, thanks so much for joining us. When you look at the statistics here, I mean, the crime rate in Chicago is absolutely ridiculous. We're up to 581 shootings through November 5th. That's
right.
2016, you can see 771, and then the list goes down from there. But do you think that the gun laws are going to solve this problem?
Oh, gosh, no. And, you know, yeah, it's sad. We're closing in on a grim milestone here of 600 murders, which we're almost sure to hit, unfortunately, in Chicago. I think that Chicago, and I say this as a longtime Chicago resident, somebody who's raising a family in the city, Chicago, unfortunately, it's a great city, but it's being ruined, and it's become the encapsulation, really, of failed blue state policies, whether it's our failed educational system, our fiscal budget nightmare, or the most dangerous streets, as we're talking about, literally the most dangerous streets probably in the developed world, right here in Chicago. Chicago has incredibly strict gun control laws. It's extremely difficult to legally get a firearm here, but that certainly doesn't stop the criminals. Just as it didn't stop the criminal maniac in Sutherland in Texas, unfortunately, it doesn't stop people on the west side of Chicago either who have criminal intent.
But, Steve, you know, Democrats would argue, from what I've read of their perspective, is that they say that the gun laws in Chicago have actually gotten more lax in recent years, that you can that gun stores, they wanted to keep gun stores out of the city. Now they're allowed back in. Do you see any truth to that?
Well, Rob, there is some truth. They have gotten slightly more lax. In other words, it used to be an almost complete prohibition on guns. Yeah. The city didn't loosen up, though, because they wanted to. It's because of federal lawsuits trying to protect the Second Amendment rights of Chicagoans. So it is possible now to get a gun, but it's very onerous. You have to go through extensive training, extensive background checks. It's very expensive. And look, criminals simply don't do that. I mean, do you think that a gangbanger says, you know, I'm going to go to class, I'm going to do this the right way and get a concealed carry permit? I mean, of course they don't. You know, I mean, that's it, and it is really laughable to think so. But what isn't laughable is what's happening on the streets of Chicago. And kids in many neighborhoods in this city literally can't go to the park to play or are worried going to and from school in the morning. This is a city, by the way, that has been controlled by Democrats almost 100%. The last Republican mayor here was in 1931. Wow. So I would put it to the Democrats who completely control the city council and, as I said, have controlled the mayoralty for almost a century. What is it that you're doing that can make Chicago better? And how can you argue that you haven't failed miserably in this city?
But, Steve, is it fair to say that Chicago is the problem when you look at other states around Chicago that have pretty weak gun laws, specifically Wisconsin and Indiana? I mean, going back to the beginning of the segment when that reporter asked Donald Trump that question, it was about, do you think that we need better gun vetting, right. I think was what she said, to not exactly quote her. But what's your thought on that?
Yeah. No, and listen, Jillian, that it is a valid point that certainly, yes, we have states that are far more pro-Second Amendment. I wouldn't say weak gun laws. I would say pro-Second Amendment gun laws nearby. But why then isn't Indianapolis a shootout? Why isn't Milwaukee, Wisconsin to the degree that Chicago is, if that's the case? So I don't think that's the issue. The issue is Chicago-specific policies, and I think more than anything, it's two things. It's a failure of our educational system, and then it's also that the Chicago police know that the Chicago politicians do not have their back. And so the Chicago police, and I can't really blame them when I talk to them, cop buddies of mine, they have largely pulled back. They are reactionary rather than being preemptive on many of our streets, and I can't blame them for that.
Let's take this back to Texas real quick. One last question. Do you think people should be able to get their hands on semi-automatic weapons legally? And put bump stocks on those to make a weapon that can kill dozens of people in a matter of minutes before police can even get there?
Right. Look, I think prohibitions on bump stocks, because that to me is not part of the Second Amendment. Bump stocks, that might be very reasonable. Although I also fear with 3D printing and so forth that, you know, somebody who's got any technical skill is going to be able to make an effective bump stock anyway. But let's make that more difficult. I'm fine with that. As far as semi-autos, though, Rob, you know, they really get a bad rap here. And I think sometimes just because these guns sort of look scary or they look like they're military grade, they're not. Semi-automatic just means every pull a bullet comes out, which is true of a lot of hunting rifles that don't look scary to most people. So should semi-automatics be legal? Yes, of course they should, and they should be in the right hands. Down in Texas, that criminal was effectively gun controlled. He was not legally allowed to get a gun. He obviously did anyway. Thank goodness that those heroic men who intervened were not gun controlled, that they had a semi-automatic weapon so that they could stop the carnage and get it and keep it from getting even worse.
Absolutely. Steve Cortes, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thanks, Steve.